Thank you all so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it, helping us celebrate 20 years of the MRI Coordination Office here in Bern, Switzerland. This lecture is the 5th in a series celebrating this anniversary. And our goal with this lecture series is to showcase MRI-funded synthesis research and also build capacity in the mountain research community. My name is Gabrielle Vance. I am here in Bern, Switzerland, but I'm from Alaska originally. As you can see in my background here, this is the Mendenhall Glacier in Juneau, Alaska, where I come from. And I'm really excited today to talk to you about something I'm really passionate about, which is communicating science effectively in English. And I hope that this will be helpful for you and interactive. And please feel free to, if you have questions at any point, raise your hand, unmute yourself, ask in the chat. Please note that we are recording and adjust if you turn your video or audio on or off accordingly. But I really want this to be a helpful resource for the community. So I have some ideas of things I'd like to share, but I'm very welcome to your inputs too. So I'll give a short informal lecture and then we'll have plenty of time for questions and answers throughout and also at the end. All right, so one moment. Cool. So as I said, I'm from Alaska and I studied geology as an undergrad and a graduate student. Along the way, I also was lucky to get lots of experience with writing and communicating science in English, and still one of my favorite jobs I've ever had to this day was as a writing center tutor at the college where I studied geology as an undergrad, where other students would bring their papers to edit and revise, and I would help them with that. That was a wonderful job. I really enjoyed it. And ever since then in grad school and ever since, I've continued to, on a freelance basis, edit scientific English from all different disciplines, and particularly for international researchers, so including people with many different native languages besides English. And doing that, there are some interesting things that I've noticed, or I found patterns that I tended to give clients the same or very similar feedback over and over again. So my idea with this lecture today, which again, I hope will be, I'll also get guidance from you and what you might have questions about or things I can help make more clear for you. But my idea with this lecture was to sort of preempt the feedback I give most often and share some things I've noticed. I also feel along the way, and I'm curious to hear about others' experiences, but sometimes as scientists, we get advice that is very prescriptive or very general. For example, avoid jargon. And I know for me, when I would hear avoid jargon, I would wonder, well, okay, but what does that look like in practice? And jargon is a very judgmental term, I feel, and sometimes it is appropriate to use specific terminology. I think one example of something that used to be jargon and isn't anymore is DNA. That's definitely an abbreviation and a word that people become more familiar with over time. So instead of prescriptive advice like avoid jargon, today I'm hoping to share overarching principles to keep in mind that I think make scientific English clearer, more effective for the reader. And I like these principles because they are sort of fractal in that they apply at the level of individual sentences, the level of paragraphs, and the level of overall manuscripts. But rather than overly prescriptive advice or obsessing about grammar rules, which may or may not be rules at all, I think these are helpful things to kind of guide as I write and as I edit with the goal of effective scientific English. One more thing to keep in mind as we move through these principles today is a quote from Niels Bohr, who in my opinion is the Oscar Wilde of nuclear physics. He had a lot of really wonderful witticisms throughout his life. And one of them, to paraphrase, was this idea that the opposite of a trivial truth is false, but the opposite of a profound truth is also true. So I guess avoid jargon might be a profound truth, because sometimes you do want to use jargon, sometimes you need to avoid it, and sometimes you do want to use it. So keep those nuclear physics, Niels Bohr type paradoxes in mind as we move through this today. So the first principle I'd like to share in alphabetical order is action. So in addition to being a geologist and teaching English and editing English, I'm also a cartoonist, which you can see here. And on this slide, I wanted to illustrate some of the monsters that we as scientists do battle with in our attempts to communicate our science effectively in English. And two of these are known in English in general, and the third one is of my own devising. So on the left, we have a zombie, and zombies, usually nouns. Zombie nouns are nouns, adjectives, verbs, other nouns that people turn into even longer nouns. The funny thing is that the technical term for this is nominalization, which is itself a zombie noun, so an example of the thing it describes. So that's our zombie. In the middle, we have vampires, which vampires are adjectives or adverbs that are excessive or ineffectual, and they suck the lifeblood out of other verbs or of nouns. And then the third one, and this is just one, so these first two, as I said, are known in the English-speaking world, but the third one is, as far as I know, my own description, which is the Kraken. So the Kraken, as you may be aware, is a giant squid from Scandinavian folklore. I know for me, it figured prominently in the Pirates of the Caribbean movies as I was growing up, but it's this really terrifying giant squid creature with huge tentacles that drags ships down to the depths. And in terms of effective scientific English, or the lack thereof, for me, the Kraken is this sense of, or this maybe desire for legitimacy or wanting to seem kind of impressive. And so it leads to writing that is overwrought, that's ponderous, that's heavy, that's sinking under its own weight to the bottom of the ocean. And I don't say that to be critical. I know our field has certain conventions and cultures, and I don't think anyone ever tries to write something that is unclear or that's really hard for other people to understand, at least in a scientific context. But I think it's easy to have the Kraken kind of sneak up on us because we're used to reading a certain type of English or fulfilling these certain norms in our fields. But of course, I think these will be much clearer if we look at an example. So I just want to be very clear that throughout the talk today, I want to use positive examples from publications that the MRI has helped, whether they're from synthesis workshops or working groups. This here is a negative example that I wrote on purpose that's based on the following positive example from a real MRI publication. So this negative example here is exaggerated. It's something I wrote intentionally to illustrate all three of these monsters that we need to overcome. And as we will see, the antidote or the way to overcome all these monsters is through action. But first, let's look at what makes them so monstrous. So the implementation of transformative changes is demanded forcefully by global sustainability targets. So even though I wrote that, when I read that aloud, I have no idea what it means. I don't have a clear mental image. I don't really know who the subject is, who the main character is, and what it, he, she, they, whatever is doing. And I think that's partly where this principle of action comes in, is that when we're writing in English, really the goal is to create almost like a movie scene in the reader's mind where they're really immersed in what we're saying and they can picture it quite clearly in order to understand it. So first here in this not so clear sentence, we have a zombie noun. So the implementation, and a really good red flag for zombie nouns is this tion ending. So here, instead of implementing, instead of using a verb, we've turned the verb to implement into a noun, implementation, which really saps it of its life force. That's why it's a zombie. And as you'll see in this sentence, we could take that out without changing the meaning. But another option, if you encounter a zombie noun, is to first try to resurrect it back into a living verb. Then transformative changes, the implementation of transformative changes is demanded. So for me, this is a bit the Kraken, where it's unnecessary use of the passive voice. So instead of saying that the targets themselves demand changes, we're saying something is demanded by something else. And as you may be aware, the passive voice is really when the object of a verb receives the action of a verb. And the most classic example of this comes from, I think, American politics, where politicians will say mistakes were made. So if we say mistakes were made, that's the ultimate example of the passive voice, because there's really no subject. We don't know who made the mistakes, instead of saying I made mistakes or we made mistakes. And usually a good red flag for the passive voice is a conjugated form of the verb to be. And sometimes the past participle, as in mistakes were made. Here it's in the present, but it's still just the Kraken. It's dragging us down. We don't know what's going on. We don't know what it means. Last but not least, in this monster sentence, we have a vampire, in this case, adverb, forcefully. So demanded forcefully is redundant. A demand is forceful by definition. So it doesn't add anything to have this vampire adverb here. In fact, I would argue it weakens demanded, which is a good verb, an active verb, a descriptive verb. So I would never say, oh, we shouldn't use adjectives or adverbs at all, but we want to be wary of these vampiric ones that really undermine what we're trying to say with the nouns and verbs. So if we use action to overcome these monsters, here is a real positive example from a paper by Ignacio Palomo. And this paper resulted from an MRI-funded synthesis workshop in 2019. And if you're interested to read the entire paper, and for all of these examples today, I've included a citation and a link at the bottom of the slide. And just to mention again, I'll share this recording after the talk, and I'll also send everyone all the slides, so you don't need to worry about trying to take notes or anything like that. Everything will be available. So let's try this one. Global sustainability targets demand transformative changes. For me, I feel a sense of relief after the previous example to read this. This is a great example of action in several ways. So it has a wonderful subject, verb, object order, or SVO. And that's something that is very characteristic of English. English is a extremely rigidly, strongly subject, verb, object order language. Other languages are less so, like German, which I'm learning here in Switzerland. And so I understand that struggle from the other way. But that's something I notice a lot, where sometimes native and non-native speakers of English can get confused and have the subject and the verb and the object in a different order, or have too many words in between them. And it's going to be most clear for your readers if you have subject, verb, object in that order, in close proximity to each other, with some exceptions. For example, if you're writing a question. And this is also a good example of action in that it's in the active voice. So the subject, the targets, demand, verb, the transformative changes, the object. And then the verb itself, demand, is an active verb. We can, even though the sentence is about is kind of abstract, talking about targets, talking about changes, these are ideas, these aren't super concrete, but we can still create a more clear visual image for the reader by using a really active verb, instead of, if we go back to the, if we go back to the previous example, instead of going on about the implementation of the contribution of, and so on and so forth. We can talk about something abstract, but in a simple subject, verb, object way with active voice, with active verbs, and we can still convey it much more clearly. So one thing to keep in mind with action, though, is that sometimes so I would argue that it is almost always better to use active voice, almost always, but not every single time. So like so many things in science, every case is a little bit different. And the answer to everything is it depends. So for example, in my own field, in geology, it's often appropriate to use the passive voice because we don't always know who the main character is, or we don't always understand the mechanisms or forces that are driving what happens. So for example, in geology, you read sentences a lot along the lines of mountains were uplifted or a plate was subducted. And in that case, it's appropriate to use the passive voice because we don't really have an actor. We don't have someone or something necessarily uplifting the mountains or subducting the plates. So in that case, it makes sense to use it. And other times, you might want to really focus on the object, make the object the subject. And in those cases, it's also appropriate to use the passive voice. But in my opinion, and it is just my opinion, those cases are relatively few and far between. And it's almost always better to use the active voice. What I tend to see with clients is that people will use passive voice almost as a default because it's considered more formal, or maybe it's part of the culture of their field. But I think it's good to look at that really critically, and every time you're using the passive voice, ask yourself, is this really what I want? Would this be clearer for my reader if I said it in an active way? So the next principle, again, in alphabetical order that I'd like to share is balance. And I've illustrated it with this wonderful mountain we have here in Switzerland called Niesen, or the Niesen. And this mountain, it's almost uncanny. It is really a almost perfectly symmetrical pyramid, or isosceles triangular pyramid. And then it is next to a lake, the Lake of Thun, and the mountain reflects into the lake. So then it's even more balanced between the mountain itself and its reflection. And then on the backside of the mountain, there's a train that goes up to a little station at the top. And I've included the train tracks here in my illustration because for me, an important aspect of balance is parallelism, much like parallel train tracks. And I think this is easiest, like all of these, this is easiest to discuss and understand if we look at a positive example. So if we do that here, it's nice to have a balance of sentence lengths, a balance of different constructions. And within constructions, I find we can have balance and parallelism by comparing like with like in a comma separated list. So that's what we have here. This sentence is from a paper by the lead of the MRI's Mountain Observatories Working Group, Maria Shagedinova. And again, if you'd like to read the whole paper, the link is on the bottom of the slide. So she writes, mountain regions face multiple and simultaneous threats spanning climatic, political, economic, institutional, and biophysical domains. And I think this sentence is a good example of balance because there's a balance between the first part and the second part. The first part telling us that there are these threats and describing the threats. And then the second part describing the domains in which these threats occur. So that's one part of the balance of the sentence. Another part is that we have a comma separated list, climatic, political, economic, and so on. And each of these things is the same type of word, the same part of speech. So these are all adjectives modifying the plural noun domains at the end. And something I see a lot, and I know that I sometimes do for sure when I'm writing, is I think it's easy sometimes to, I don't know if anyone likes the TV show The Office, but there's the great character Michael Scott, the boss, and he says that sometimes he just starts a sentence and he has no idea where he's going and he hopes he finds his point along the way. I think that happens to a lot of us as we're writing. And sometimes you can have a sentence, you can just have so many things going on and start having so many parts of your list separated by commas, and suddenly you're comparing phrases with verbs, with nouns, with adjectives. And it is definitely confusing for the writer, but it's also really confusing for the reader, and it's hard for them to really fix it in their mind. So I know that commas in general and comma rules can be a tricky thing in English for native and non-native speakers. And one example of that is when you have a list of things separated by commas like this, try and make sure that they're all parallel. So you're all comparing like types of things. And again, these principles I think are helpful at multiple different scales when you're writing. So it's important to have balance within a sentence, within the parts of a sentence, and then within a paragraph, it's nice to have a balance of different sentence lengths, sometimes short, sometimes long. Within an entire manuscript, it's nice to have a balance of different constructions. And then we get a satisfying parallelism from sometimes repeating those constructions. So much like spoken English, where it can be more interesting to listen to someone who speaks with some variation, that's definitely also true of writing. The next principle I want to share, and hang in there, there are only 4 that I am sharing with you today, is clarity. And I mean clarity here in the sense of choosing the right tool for the job. So in my illustration, I've drawn a satellite and a rock hammer, which are both very effective tools in geology and in other fields, but they're for very, very different jobs. And so this idea of clarity and choosing the right tool for the job, for me, it applies to word choice and vocabulary. It applies to punctuation. It applies to construction. It's really important that when we're searching through the toolbox as we're writing, we pick the right instrument, the right tool that we need. And I would argue that in scientific English, I wouldn't speak for any other setting or field, but in scientific English, and I'd be curious to hear your thoughts during the Q&A, but clarity is the guiding goal above all. So we don't really have other narrative or stylistic concerns. We really want to communicate as clearly as possible, whether it's to the public or to other scientists. And when we're communicating to other scientists, we absolutely want to be as clear as possible, because ideally we want them to be able to replicate our work. So I think it sometimes incorporates aspects of or subsumes a lot of the other principles, because trying to be clear, striving for clarity, much like striving for objectivity, it's difficult, but it's definitely worth trying and really important for a scientific context. So looking at some examples of using the right tool for the job in terms of word choice and vocabulary, if I were to give prescriptive advice, it would be to always reach for a dictionary before a thesaurus. Or in fact, use a link to, I guess people don't often use physical dictionaries or thesauruses anymore, but in English, we have a huge toolbox of words to choose from. We have a huge vocabulary for most things. I think not colors, but compared to German, for example, English has a gigantic vocabulary, whereas our grammar is relatively simple. And we can get so many shades of meaning just by choosing words carefully. But this can also be difficult for native and non-native speakers alike, because we want to make sure that we check the definition of the word to make sure that we're using, to make sure that there aren't unintended connotations that might be jarring for the reader or make the reader stop in their tracks and kind of take them out of the flow of what they're reading. So I recommend that everyone have a favorite dictionary and consult it early and often. My personal favorite is the Oxford English Dictionary online, which does a really good job of showing multiple definitions for words, showing how meanings and usages have changed through time. And a note for those who are English learners, I do think it's important to not just look at a dictionary that translates between English and another language, but to look at an English dictionary to see the definitions and connotations. I think that is very helpful and important. So a word I've been hearing and noticing a lot recently, perhaps especially being here in Europe, is fruitful, used to describe discussions and collaborations and things of that nature. And that's fine, but for me as a native speaker and someone from the US, and I'm backed up here by the Oxford English Dictionary, the connotation or the image that I get in my mind when I read the word fruitful is really about fruit and offspring and a fruit tree laden with ripe apples or pears, or a pregnant person. And particularly in a professional and scientific context, I'm not sure that's always the intended connotation that people want. We do have here in the second definition, so the less common meaning of fruitful, productive of offspring, prolific, but it's still very focused on this kind of idea of biological fertility. So I wouldn't say, oh, this is wrong or bad or anything like that. But when I read fruitful, for me, if it's talking about a collaboration or a discussion or something, I just wonder if a word like productive or effective might be better. So I think this is a good example of trying to strive for that clarity and use the exact tool for the job. A few years ago, I got the opportunity to go to the Northwords Writers Symposium in Skagway, Alaska, which I highly recommend to all of you. It's a wonderful, wonderful writers conference for all different genres of English. And we got to hear from the author Simon Winchester, who wrote Krakatoa, one of my favorite books, among many other books. And he was adamant that every word in the English language is fit to a purpose. And he was even saying that synonyms don't really exist. So that's perhaps an extreme point of view, but it's really important to always check, what does this word really mean? What are the connotations? And then decide if you want to use it accordingly. Another example of this that I've seen recently is mainstream as a verb. And again, I think the authors intended it in the second, so the less common definition here, in the sense of to incorporate into the mainstream. But again, and I am definitely biased because I'm from the US, but for an American English speaker like myself, the first thing I think about when I read mainstreaming is this first definition of integrating classrooms in a school. And I think in these instances I've seen recently, that is not what the authors had in mind. So of course it's hard to know, but you can try to be as clear as possible and have as little ambiguity as possible by checking the definitions of some of these words. And I think mainstream is an interesting example because similar to the zombie nouns we looked at before, this is an example of verbing. I really like the comic strip Calvin and Hobbes, and Calvin has this joke about verbing Weird's language. So verbing, like turning a noun or verb into a noun, is turning a noun or an adjective into another verb. So mainstreaming, or another example I've heard recently, is foregrounding, centering. And this is in a way how language evolves over time. So some purists would say, oh, you shouldn't use contact as a verb, you shouldn't use prioritize as a verb, you shouldn't use influence. And those are all verbs that I feel like are pretty common by now and pretty unobjectionable. But with some of these newer ones, such as mainstreaming, foregrounding, centering, I just recommend using with caution and considering, is there an existing, more commonly understood word that will get the job done? If so, maybe use that. If not, maybe you want to contribute to moving the language forward and you really do want to say mainstreaming and you want to keep it more in usage so that perhaps over time, this second definition becomes the first definition. That's fine too. I think with clarity and with effective scientific English in general, we want to use language that's as simple as possible, but not simpler. and as few words as possible, but not fewer. So again, it's more nuanced than just avoid jargon or be clear, but use the specific words, the specific constructions, the specific punctuation that will have the greatest chance of the readers understanding what we mean. The fourth principle I'd like to share with you today, definitely very closely related with clarity, is consistency. And to illustrate consistency, I have a Swiss train and the iconic Swiss rail clock that appears in all the, Swiss railway stations. And for someone like myself from Alaska, the infrastructure of public transport here in Switzerland and how consistent it is really nothing short of miraculous. It's so incredible how well planned out things are, how punctual everything is. And it has the result that as a passenger, speaking from my own experience, but I feel so taken care of. I know what to expect. And I think that's really important when we're writing, because being consistent is a way of taking care of the reader so that they know what to expect, so that they feel at ease. And that might be a piece of advice that I give most often, or the feedback that I give most often is some variation on be intentional and then be consistent. So it doesn't really matter so much what conventions you use, as long as you're internally consistent within your manuscript and within everything you write. This could apply from things to spellings, to conventions of punctuation, to the way you abbreviate or use units. A lot of times one convention is as good as another, but just be internally consistent with whatever you are using. So as an example of this, I have a sentence from a policy brief that the MRI helped the United Nations Environmental Program, the Global Mountain Biodiversity Assessment, and other collaborators work on. Indicators suggested in CBD SABS to 24.3 add 1, don't worry about that, it's just the name of a previous policy brief, fall into 3 groups: headline, component, and complementary. And I think this sentence illustrates consistency in a couple of ways. So one important aspect of consistency for me is subject-verb agreement, and that's something that can trip up native and non-native speakers of English. So it's always important to check that if you have a plural subject like indicators, you have a plural verb like suggested and fall. This also shows consistency in that we use an Oxford comma. And that is circled in blue here. So the Oxford comma or serial comma refers to if you have a comma separated list like X, Y, and Z, or headline, component, and complementary. It's the last comma before the and. Some people like to use an Oxford comma. Personally, I do. Some people don't like to. I don't think it matters either way, but that's something where you definitely want to be consistent. Either you always use the Oxford comma or you never do. If you use it sometimes and not other times, that's where we get into issues. So those are 2 ways that I think this sentence illustrates consistency. Another example that I noticed recently in my own writing is referring to things in consistent ways. And again, this is where I think clarity really comes in too. So I noticed that over the course of maybe 2 paragraphs, I referred to the same thing as a specimen, an object, and a sample. And I started to get really confused. What am I talking about? And I realized it was a rock every time. I didn't need to use all those different words. So I went back through and consistently referred to it as a rock because it was a rock. So that's another way I think consistency is really helpful. Sometimes we do want to use the different words for the same thing for variety, but if you really are talking about the same thing every time, referring to it in the same way every time will definitely be helpful. So I wanted to share just a few resources to go along with these principles that, again, are things I've just noticed by doing, that I've noticed by editing and reading and writing. And most of these resources are not, in fact, focused on science specifically, but I think it's true that helpful advice for English in general often does apply to scientific English in particular. There are sometimes field-specific considerations, specific terminology that we need to use, but I do think these resources could be helpful for anyone who's interested in communicating science clearly in English, whether that's to the public or to other scientists. So again, my favorite dictionary is the Oxford English Dictionary, the OED Online. Again, I'll send you the slides if you want to go check it out. They have wonderful historical information, etymologies. They also do fun things like the new words they've added every month and the word of the year. So similar to a paper dictionary, you can have fun spending time flipping through and seeing what interesting things you find. A couple of books about style that I've personally read and highly recommend are Dreyer's English by Benjamin Dreyer, which is quite funny and amusing and shares a lot of specific opinions. And also, I think, makes the great point about often in English and talking about English grammar in particular, people get really obsessed by these are the rules and you've broken the rules. But what's important is to be clear. So if it's more clear to break a rule, like starting a sentence with a conjunction or ending it with a preposition or splitting an infinitive or using the passive voice, you know, that is what we should do and just be ready to justify that. I know one of my professors in geology in college would say, you just have to have a story as long as it's right. It doesn't matter if it's wrong or right, as long as you have a story. So having a justification for the intentional, consistent choice you've made is more important than sometimes these somewhat arbitrary rules that are more like lore. So the idea of zombie nouns, I think, comes first from this article by Helen Sword that might be interesting to read. Sorry, I forgot to mention The Sense of Style by Steven Pinker is a really great recent English advice book as well. And what I really liked about this one that I definitely noticed too is Pinker addresses the issue of excessive signposting in academic writing. And I think this is definitely true in scientific English. So by signposting, he means phrases like, this article will, and as mentioned above, and these sort of almost like breaking the fourth wall in a play where the actor talks to the audience. So these are things where the writer is reminding the reader that they're reading instead of just sharing their science or their methods or their results or whatever. They're inserting these excessive signposts, and he argues that they're really not that necessary. They're helpful when you're talking, but if someone's reading, they can look back at the previous paragraph. You know, they're able to visually scan. So it's not so important to do that and takes up perhaps too much space. I thought that was a really interesting idea. The Elements of Style by Strunk and White is the absolute classic. Dreyer's English does mention they do have some somewhat self-contradictory rules, but definitely cannot hurt to read and incorporate their advice. I personally really like William Zinsser, and he addresses a lot of how to write clearly in terms of nonfiction and science specifically. He has a lot of advice about riding to victory on the back of a strong declarative sentence. So that's also a great one to insert into your rotation. Here at the University of Bern, we have really great support for academic writing, including classes in person and online. And there's an editor, Dr. Callie Tall, who gives wonderful workshops online at the moment about English composition, about constructing paragraphs, about how to put papers together. So I highly recommend those to anyone. And then just for fun, Lake Superior State University in the US publishes a list of banished words every year as a bit of a publicity stunt, but it's also good to consider if you're worried about using too many buzzwords. You might check the banished words list to see what you might want to avoid in the coming year. And if anyone wants to go to Northwords like I did, here is the link for that. So those are just a few helpful resources to keep in mind in addition to the principles I've shared, which I hope are more helpful than rules. If we just keep this goal in mind of prose that's active, balanced, clear, and consistent. I think that helps us make a lot of these decisions along the way that can be kind of confusing otherwise. And before we move on into questions and answers, I just wanted to share one more quote from Niels Bohr, which is, what is it that we human beings ultimately depend on? We depend on our words. We're suspended in language. Our task is to communicate experience and ideas to others. And I really enjoy the sense of this, but I also enjoy that it's an example of breaking the rules to be more clear. So ending a sentence with a preposition here, what is it that we depend on? He didn't say on what is it that we depend. So thank you very much. I really appreciate the chance to share this topic that's close to my heart with you today, and I hope we can have an interesting discussion. I'd love to see raised hands or hear questions or share in the chat, so please feel very free. You can also unmute yourself at any point. I will go ahead and stop sharing, and I see we have a comment already in the chat from David. I prefer no serial comma in a list, but sometimes it is useful to separate a preposition that has some kind of differentiation from previous items. That's an interesting point. I mean, David, would you care to unmute yourself and elaborate? I'd love to hear more. Or if anyone else has any questions, feedback, concerns.
Well, I wasn't expecting you to ask me to elaborate.
Oh, only if you feel like it. I'd just love to hear more.
I know there's a big difference between British and American.
Mm-hmm.
And I like certain aspects of British writing and certain aspects of American writing. And there are times when I feel I have to use a serial comma to separate a longish kind of item after 2 or 3 other items, because either the structure of the sentence has changed slightly or it is a different semantic content. So I just thought I'd throw that in. I mean, I don't have any examples in my mind.
Well, I think that's a really good point. And that reminds me of another piece of feedback that I tend to give really often, that I think that, especially in the US, because I think people are afraid sometimes, but I think semicolons are woefully underused. So sometimes people are trying to make these poor commas do so much work, separating these really long lists that are themselves, the items in the list are full of commas. So don't be afraid to use the semicolon when the need arises. It really, I feel like as a reader, gives my eyes and my mind a nice break and a nice resting place. And I can really understand, okay, these are the different parts and they have commas within them. Semicolon or hyphen. Well, I think, so hyphens are really interesting. I know there's a whole book like Usage Wars all about hyphens or dashes, but James, could you elaborate more on what you're asking here in the chat? So for me, I think if you have a list and the items in the list have commas within them, instead of separating those items with a comma, because it's really hard to read, I recommend using a semicolon. But perhaps, well, James, you'd like to share what you
I tend to tell authors, just break it down into 2 or 3 sentences if it's starting to get very long. Then I find myself making a long sentence and say, well, I better listen to the advice I'm giving to other people.
Right.
I find it just much easier.
Yeah, I think that's the use case. I mean, as David says, probably the best solution is often to break it down into several sentences. And really my question was, if you do have this quite long multi-claused sentence, often if you have a sort of an idea to insert somewhere in the middle, I would sometimes use hyphens, and then maybe with a subclause to sort of insert on the end, I would then use maybe a semicolon. But I was just wondering on your perspectives on this, or whether it's really just best to break everything down into 3 or 4 sentences.
I think it depends. I think it does go to this idea of having some variety. So having a mix of short, medium, and long sentences, that's nicer for the reader. Personally, for the type of sort of parenthetical aside you're describing, yeah, it could be a parentheses. For me, I often use not a hyphen, but a dash, the longer one for that kind of aside. I think the hyphen is more for putting 2 words together that it would be really hard to read. So it's like that shorter dash. And then for, yeah, the sort of comment you're describing, I would use the longer one, but that is also maybe something that might be different on either side of the pond. And so I think, yeah, I think this is a really important nuanced conversation. So it's not just that you always should break things down into the shortest, simplest possible sentences. That is a good thing to definitely look at, but sometimes it can be nice, or it can be more effective to have a long one, as long as it's constructed appropriately in a balanced way with the specific punctuation that really fits. In the chat, Megan shared, hi Megan, thanks for coming. Yeah, in the US, people do, a lot of editors do tend to loathe and fear semicolons. And I think it's just a lack of awareness, or sometimes I know working with students, sometimes people sprinkle them in just to be fancy. And so I think maybe, especially in the US, we just need more of a public awareness campaign about the semicolon is your friend. I like to think of it as the super comma. So it's like a comma, but even more powerful. It's gone on a journey and gained knowledge, and it can help you do even more things than a comma can. So
be careful it doesn't come political in the United States.
Oh, true. Well, that's always something to be aware of, for sure. Another thing I just wanted to mention as something that might be helpful for people to consider, because I know I find I do this a lot, thinking about clarity in terms of the order in which we write. I find that as I'm writing, and maybe you do too, a lot of the time, sort of like Michael Scott, I kind of find the point along the way. And so sometimes what I've written after I write it, I need to invert it because I found my point along the way. And maybe what I was really trying to get to, or the subject or the meat of it, ended up being at the end of my sentence. So this might drive you crazy. I think it's important to find what works for you, but I tend to self-edit as I go and often check, did I bury the lead? Did I write this backwards? Perhaps others might prefer to do that in a different order, to self-edit at the end, but that's something that's good to be aware of. I know people also find reading out loud or trying to say something really conversationally can be helpful for that purpose of improving clarity too. I also just wanted to mention, maybe as a piece of advice, that it's of course great to work with an editor if you can, but having anyone else, any disinterested, objective party look at your work is a wonderful, helpful luxury. Obviously, it's so much easier to see the issues with something someone else has written than what you've written when you're so close to it. And I'm not sure how common this is, would love to hear from people, but I think that in proposals, it should be standard to say we include as a line item in the budget, working with a technical editor to make the communication of our results as successful as possible. So other questions or comments or concerns from the chat, or anything anyone wants to share?
Hi, Gabrielle.
Hi.
I just raised my hand there.
Oh, sorry, didn't see you.
No, that's okay. No worries. No worries. I can just jump in. Thank you for the talk. It was it was very interesting, very, very topical, I think, because there's so much research being done these days. My main question, and the way you've presented a lot of this, is from a basis of kind of a creative writing, and a lot of those, the elements of style, those kind of books that you've referenced are very much directed more at creative writing and those kind of fiction and other genres. So is it something that you would suggest to scientists and people who are doing a lot of academic publishing to take a creative writing class? And then a second kind of piece of that is, should we include a little bit more of that creative writing style in academic publishing, in literature that's really designed for a scientific audience? Because I find sometimes I want to add a little bit of flair, so to speak, to what I'm writing from an academic perspective, but often that's again edited out, like Megan had suggested. You get suggested to kind of make it more more simple, more general, more scientific.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I mean, on a certain level, clear writing is clear writing regardless of the context, but I definitely know what you mean. I think it would be great for more scientists to take just composition in general, but I also feel like, at least in my experience, there is a lack, or there could be more of this niche of how do we apply these principles that people tend to associate more with fiction, as you said, in a scientific way, in the type of writing we're trying to do. Because I feel like a lot of the things I've learned or that I've noticed, they weren't necessarily in a science communication class or an English class. They were just from reading papers and writing papers and noticing these things. I felt like as a scientist, the advice I've gotten has been very much, avoid jargon, or the public needs to know the why of what you're doing, which is true. But again, it's like, how do I, when I'm writing, how do I then translate that on a sentence level or a paragraph level or manuscript level? So I think that that's something, I guess that's what I'm hoping to go a bit in that direction with this talk today. And I hope other things in the future, is there's definitely a need for scientists to have more support, to communicate within the conventions of their field, within the cultures of their fields, but also in a way that will be as clear as possible for readers. So I think it would always be great to take creative writing, but we also need these more specific classes as well, for sure. Oh, sorry, you're on mute.
Sorry, it's funny building on that. I live in France right now, and learning French, they talk about the vulgarisation, vulgarizing things to make it basically, which is the French word for making things simpler and in layman's terms. And that's something that in academic publishing we should almost stress a little bit more, to have almost a 2-pager that goes along with your academic publishing, that you've published, so that the public can understand it in a bit of a simpler way. And then obviously scientists can dive deeper. That could be something potentially grow. And I know there's a couple of journals now that do, especially I know Frontiers does a lot of work. They have like a Frontiers for Kids. Really, it's taking scientific articles that other people have written and have published in their journals, and then making it accessible for kids and making it usable for, science classes, for elementary education and that kind of thing. So I think that's something that should be, we should try to push that a little bit more, so that it can get disseminated further, like you've said. And then having more visibility for these kind of science.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a great direction. I know for me, I'm always excited too at conferences or in journals to see plain language abstracts. I think that's a great direction for different fields to take. But I also think it's incredibly important when communicating with across disciplines, which is very trendy right now, but also within disciplines, that we're communicating clearly to other scientists too, and even using specific terminology, but doing it in a way that's not overwrought, that's not making the reader do extra work that they don't need to do. Let's see, Megan shared in the chat another book about creative writing in science. Writing Science, How to Write Papers That Get Cited and Proposals That Get Funded, illustration. Wow, that sounds great. I haven't read that. I only wanted to recommend things I personally read and used, but I'm definitely going to add that to the to read list. Thank you, Megan. Yeah, that sounds very, very helpful. Thoughts on Grammarly from James. So I guess I don't have thoughts on Grammarly. I've never used it. James, have you used it, or do you have thoughts on it?
No, I've just seen the adverts, which seem very effective at, for instance, improving the conciseness of sentences, word choice options, and both for non-native speakers and native speakers. I mean, in theory, I was wondering to what extent this could actually do away, through the presumably sort of the machine learning algorithms and things they have underneath there, to what extent this might do away with all these questions, or the expertise, or the need to either employ a technical editor or know enough of the rules and things which you've been discussing already, or whether this might evolve in that direction in the future, really. Used it.
So this is something that I have definitely thought a lot about recently with machine learning and AI. And another book that's super interesting, not about science specifically, but the bestseller code, where they take a corpus and analyze the text of bestsellers and try to predict future ones. But I think that Grammarly, or AI in general, these algorithms are really, really good for certain types of issues. So for the more formulaic, the more rule-based. So for example, I have by hand gone through a 200-page PhD thesis where every subject-verb agreement was wrong, from a non-native speaker, or where every comma placement was wrong, or where there were no articles. And so I think those types of things, obviously it would be amazing for an algorithm, for an AI, for a machine to just take care of that, because that's so rote. personally, I do feel like some things still benefit from a human touch. I think that's tricky because you then get into things that are more subjective and more biased. And I never want to be a gatekeeper with language. I just want to help people who want help, communicate as clearly as possible. I never want to be about, being, using the certain word to be in the certain club to show your certain way. But I do think, especially with non-native speakers, but with native speakers too, I think the human touch is still really needed for the sense or the connotations. Or sometimes I'll tell clients, well, this isn't incorrect, this isn't wrong, but it's not the way a native speaker might phrase it, or it might just be unnecessarily confusing for your reader. So I think those types of things at this point still really benefit from a human editor, depending on who that editor is and their own biases and preferences and whatnot. And I think that AI has a way to go to get to that level, but I do think that's a really good point and a really interesting question. And a lot of it is really just a craft. It's being a technician. And so to the extent we can get machines to do all that stuff and free all of us to be more creative and to write and communicate, I think that would be great. Despite the usefulness of Grammarly, I found that an academic editor was essential for theses. Gavin, good point. So I think it also depends on the context and the magnitude. So maybe for an email or something that you're generating more regularly, I know there's something else, I forget if it's called Email Tune or Word Tune or something. There are programs you could use just to check your emails. But for something like a thesis or a manuscript that is such a huge investment of time, it is great to work with a professional. And I know some at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, where I went to grad school, we had some professors who would say, I will not look at a student's thesis until they take it to a technical editor first. So yes, it definitely depends on the magnitude and formality of what you're writing too, whether you want to use Grammarly. Yeah, the Purdue OWL, I saw David shared that resource, super helpful resource for that. David, was there something else you wanted to add?
Have you heard of that experiment that they did some years ago now, whereby they got a machine to construct and write an essay or academic article, which they submitted to a journal, and it was accepted?
I have heard of various different sort of stings in academic publishing. So articles generated by AIs or articles that were just translations of books in other languages or completely made up. So I think that is interesting too, that in kind of the academic publishing sphere, we do need to be on the watch or be on the lookout for these kind of predatory journals or journals that are claiming to have peer review, but then obviously aren't. I mean, I think this one example I saw, the authors or the people doing the sting had an article that was a translation of a chapter from Mein Kampf into English, just translated it from German to English and submitted it to a journal, and that was accepted. So, things like that are very disturbing and distressing. And I think we want to focus on, how can we use the technology that we have to make our lives easier and to correct and improve the things that humans have written. And but I guess it can be good to check for some of these less than ideal journal practices. Yes, Roberto, thank you for coming. And I will definitely send everyone all the resources, all the slides, the recording. So no need to worry if you didn't get your notes, but we are almost out of time and I want to respect everybody's time today, but are there any last questions, comments? I know it's a huge topic that we could, there's plenty more to say about, but I really appreciate the chance to share it with everyone today. Anyone else? Thank you. Yeah, thanks so much.
Yeah, could maybe just say, Gabrielle, that it's obvious that your passion for writing comes out here, and I think we can all really appreciate that you have a very strong knowledge for academic writing, and it seems like you probably very good creative writer as well. I assume you've written a novel or something based on it.
Thank you.
I would love to read it.
Thank you. I haven't, but I've been thinking about, the way some people run marathons. I'm like, maybe I should do National Novel Writing Month one year, NaNoWriMo. It'd be kind of that endurance challenge. Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate that.
Yeah.
I really appreciate all of you for coming, and please feel free to email anytime. It's just a fun topic to talk about. And wishing everyone a great day wherever you are in the world. I'll be sure to be in touch with all the resources from today. And I will, when I email you, I'll send you the next lecture in the series as well, because it might be interesting for you too. So thank you all so much. Really appreciate it. Bye.